Hi, my name is Gil Robertson, president of the African American Film Critics Association. Today we have a real treat for you as we are talking to the creators responsible for Black and Blues, the story of Louis B. Armstrong, an amazing documentary that is airing on Apple TV+. We're going to kick things off by introducing you to the AAFCA members who are on the call today, starting with today's facilitator, Rhonda Rasha Penrice in Atlanta, Janine Coveney in Philadelphia. And Janine, where are you? In Virginia Beach. In Virginia Beach, Virginia. Carolyn Hines in Toronto. Janita Davis, newly moved to Denver, Colorado. Dana Abercrombie in New York, New York. Mr. Ray Cornelius in Atlanta, Georgia. And Karan Lemois in Charlottesville, Virginia. And let's not forget about Mr. Al McGee in South Florida. I'm going to let you folks do what you do so well, and I will see you on the other side.
Do you think you've lost by being born Black in a white country?
No, I don't look at it that way.
The greatest influence in jazz of all time, Louis Armstrong.
Old empty bed.
Jazz almost stems from Louis Armstrong.
Wished I was dead. What did I do?
Anybody who has uttered a sound on American radio,
So black and blue.
it's because of Louis Armstrong's innovations.
He
never would come out publicly, but at home he had his opinions.
I've heard recordings of Pops just talking. He understood there was a battle in this country.
I don't have no flag other than a black flag.
That's right.
There's a rumor that you invented scat singing.
It came to me just like that.
To be black in those days, the discrimination was unbelievable.
His
own inner dignity was able to make him prevail over all these awful conditions he worked with.
What did I do?
He was the first black movie performer to have his name above the title.
He was trying to use his music to reform and lead the country closer to his higher ideals.
Arkansas had decided to make its own laws on the subject of integration.
Louis said Ike and the government could go to hell.
Everybody was astonished, but privately, he expressed stuff like that all his life.
My only sin
All over the world,
is in my skin.
he had the respect
They laugh at you
and the love of millions.
and spoil you too. What did I do
What more can any man ask for?
to be so black and blue?
I was so pleasantly surprised at this beautiful documentary. This felt like his love letter to us. And even though he passed before I was born, I was really inspired by how connected he was and grounded with the community and the civil rights movement. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was profound. I'd like to know what surprised you in discovery of his tapes and discovery of this amazing artwork that we had never had a chance to see before.
Well, growing up Black and loving Public Enemy when I did, what I thought I knew of Mr. Armstrong was contrary to who he really is or who he was. I mean, I thought that he was an Uncle Tom. I thought all kinds of crazy things that it's third and fourth hand information that doesn't really make sense once you learn who he really was. And you think about where we are today in popular culture, where you have recording artists who tell you how much money they have, how rich they are, want to get into politics that they don't understand. And you want to call Louis Armstrong and Uncle Tom. I think there's an artist today who's much it's easy to identify a particular artist who's popular today as an Uncle Tom than you can Louis Armstrong. And his sort of ability to, I call it this sort of psychological emotional jujitsu, to work through all that America had to serve him and still remain patriotic. You know, for me, what touched me was something that many African Americans deal with, this sort of love of country and still being loyal to a country that is not loyal to you and still finding a way to make it. And when I learned all these things about him, I was totally floored, especially since it was completely contrary to who I thought he was in my youth. And when you hear, you know, Miles Davis, who you always heard of, Miles Davis thought he was a sellout. And then Miles Davis says, well, the guy that you know, Louis Armstrong, who's cracking those jokes and having those facial expressions, he's doing that with his friends. So is he an Uncle Tom? And then when you hear Armstrong himself ask, when have I ever effing Uncle Tom? In the film, when you hear it, it's like, yeah, well, actually, when did he? And you really think about it and you realize that, like, he never did. So I don't know if I answered the initial question. I think I went all over the place like the cyclone roller coaster, but he's just, I don't think you can name someone in contemporary popular culture who had the ability to be a fine artist, because his artwork is phenomenal and it wasn't for the world. It was something that just brought joy to him. He could sing his ass off, play his instrument, look sharp, tell jokes, and was extremely intelligent for someone who didn't have a quote unquote formal education. Who can you name in the modern era that has this kind of talent and this kind of ability to navigate a world that was extremely hostile to him? And yeah, he had a smile on his face, but there's way more to that smile than you'll ever know.
I think I can, I'll go next if it's okay, but I think Sacha just really summed it up beautifully. And the only thing I can possibly add to that is that Louis, while he was very much alive and beginning roughly in about 1955, started making these audio tapes, which really became like a daily diary almost of places he'd been, conversations he was having with people, sometimes at his house, sometimes backstage. He actually installed this incredible audio recording system at his house, which is featured in the movie. And what you hear on those tapes, and when we first even had access to the tapes from the foundation, it was very clear that he was conscious of how his story was going to be told in the future. And he was very conscious of the fact that he wanted to tell his story. So it would be irrefutable to anybody down the road, long past his time on this planet, as to how things happened and why they happened and how he felt about certain things. And he says on the tapes, they were for posterity. And between the tapes and the conversations that he had and these incredible scrapbooks, which we also feature in the movie, which are works of art unto themselves, almost as much as his music is, that history and his version of his own narrative was paramount. And that became abundantly clear, not to speak for Sacha and Jason and Julie, you know, who are really on the front end of the editing of this movie. But our guiding principle was always, well, let's let Louis tell his own story. You know, we're the custodians of it, and we'll do the best job we can to put it into a format that is accessible to an audience. But it's really all coming from Louis. And I think that's what's remarkable about it, that he had the foresight to be able to do that on top of everything Sacha said. Again, who's doing that today? Who's thinking that far in advance? That he's very well aware of his place in history, and he wants to make sure that not even setting the record straight, just setting the record by him being able to tell it. And it was really inspiring and remarkable, and truly an honor for, I think, all of us to get to spend the time that we did with him, literally with him, while we made this movie.
You know, it's not often mentioned, but jazz is the only original art form that came from America, and you honored him well with his legacy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Al McGee. I'm with YETicket.com. Well, I'm a former college professor, and I developed a program to teach about Louis Armstrong when I used to teach humanities on the college level. And I always found him fascinating. I never found him as an Uncle Tom. I always found him a very brilliant musician. But did you find that he was the first pop musician at the time? And also, how did you find out how did he really learn how to play, and how did he learn how to play with so much ability without being formally educated?
You know, I would kind of consider him the first pop artist. You know, he was the first, you know, global superstar on an international level who touched all people in all countries through his travels, you know, through the fan base that he was able to create. You know, as far as, you know, from what I gathered from just all the recordings and from the history that we dug into, you know, his training was just basically just through doing it. You know, he first was at the Waif's Home for Boys, where he got his initial training from Peter Davis. But then he was on the steamships, and he would go back and forth on steamships. He got other training. And then he also went into New York, where he got trained with Fletcher Henderson. Then he was in Chicago. And so he's into all these different places, and he has all these different mentors teaching him all these different techniques. But then also, he's also bringing his own spirit. He's also bringing his own kind of, you know, his own kind of thing to playing that nobody else could kind of duplicate at the time, right? He brought his own swing to it. He brought his own flavor, if you will. So it's really interesting. And, you know, I worked with Sacha on a doc about Rick Jenkins before this one. And I saw the similarities and the parallels between Rick and Louis, where it's a kind of amalgamation of all these prior influences with the mix of whatever is in your own soul and personality and humanity, and all mixed in. So when you mix it all in, you have this kind of beautiful synthesis of just creativity and art, right? And that's what really you know, came through with Louis. You know, and to speak to the being a pop star, not only was he a worldwide musician, as you guys well know, I mean, he was a movie star, right? He was in all these films that people just weren't in, that Black entertainers were not in. You know, he did over, you know, 20 some odd movies. And even though there were smaller roles, you always, you know, I think movie producers, movie makers always wanted to make sure they had a little bit of Louis Armstrong in their films to give it that pop, to give it that kind of flavor again, to give it that spirit, that Louis spirit. So that was all fascinating and all stuff that I wasn't aware of about Louis.
I would almost argue that he was classically trained, because I had a friend in elementary school who went to Juilliard every Saturday, and they taught them first to learn by ear, not by reading notes, by ear. That was the first way at Juilliard you learned music, and that's exactly how Louis learned, by ear. He had to later learn to read music, but because he was learning by ear, everything was intuitive for him, right? He sort of like wasn't bound by the boundaries of teaching, right? This is how you do it, and this is how you do it correctly. And so he had much more freedom, I think, than a classically trained musician. And what he had was tremendous mentors and people who wanted to play with him, and a lot of support. So I think in essence, that is classically trained.
I also think, just to draw a comparison to what Sacha was saying earlier about, you know, some of the hip hop artists that we all grew up listening to, you know, Louis was also sampling, you know, very much what he heard, which, you know, wasn't a term that was used back then, but like Julie was saying, you know, he could play by ear. He had a gift that he could literally hear something and he could play it. And, you know, the trumpet, even as an instrument, didn't exist in its current form when he first started playing. He learned on a cornet, which had come out of marching band music. And jazz, or what later became, you know, known as jazz, was a true form of as someone just said on this call, I think it was Janine, about musical expression, a true American art form. You know, there was nothing that had been played before that really directly informed jazz. It was the music that he was hearing in New Orleans. It was the music that was coming through the streets on the marching bands. It was music that was coming from Africa and from the slaves that had moved there. It was music that was coming up from the Caribbean in this this gumbo of New Orleans at the time. When we went over to the archive for the very first time, there's the lead archivist at the Louis Armstrong Foundation is a gentleman named Ricky Riccardi, and he played a very early recorded run that Louis did on the trumpet. I don't remember what song it was. And then he plays a Caruso record, opera aria from about 10 years prior to when Louis had made that record. And it's uncanny to hear the similarities. And so Ricky purports, you can't totally prove this, that he must have heard this record, or he must have heard versions of this coming from some of the places where he was at that time. And then he added his own twist to it. And that's really what I think made him a true original. And there's a line in the movie, I think, Jason, it's already shot, if I'm not mistaken, but he says, there's no record of music that came before him that could have possibly informed the way that he ended up playing. So when you talk about why he's a genius, it's because he's playing stuff that there was no recorded or memory record of prior. It was completely original, which is what makes him just truly unbelievable. And it's hard to even compare him to other musical artists because he was doing something that there was nothing existed before.
Hi, I'm Janine Coveney with the Words on Flicks show podcast. I'm also a jazz journalist. And it's interesting, it was Karen that said about the jazz.
Sorry, yeah, no, I said Karen, apologies.
No, but I totally agree with her. And I just put that same idea in my script for the Jazz Music Awards that we just held Saturday night in Atlanta. But Sacha, you've been a music journalist as well. You're a writer as well as a filmmaker. And I know that your background, you've covered a lot of hip hop culture. And Justin just mentioned hip hop culture in this context. And we know that jazz is a direct antecedent of hip hop. So what attracted you to this story of Louis Armstrong, and what should the current hip hop generation learn from Louis Armstrong?
Well, the very nice people at Imagine Entertainment reached out to me. One of them is on this Zoom right now, Mr. Justin Wilkes. And when I was presented with the opportunity, again, being a hip hop person, I didn't really know much about Armstrong, but what I've learned from doing films about Rick James, doing films about Wu-Tang Clan, and now Louis Armstrong, it's the same story over and over again. You can claim that there are genres, there's jazz, there's blues, there's rock and roll, but it all comes from the same place. You've got to understand the people to understand the output. And, Louis Armstrong's early beginnings can easily be that of a rapper in terms of what he faced and what he dealt with, dealing with police, dealing with everything that he says. I've heard from Rick James's people, I've heard from RZA. It's the same thing over and over again. So, if I have to really talk about what the hip hop world should learn about Louis Armstrong, don't look to Kanye West for a goddamn thing. He is an Uncle Tom, okay? Louis Armstrong is not an Uncle Tom. Louis Armstrong does not inspire white supremacists to say Kanye was right, to say that Louis Armstrong was right. Louis Armstrong was about it. And if Louis Armstrong didn't make the sacrifices that he made, no, there probably wouldn't be recorded hip hop music in the way that we have it today. So what hip hop has to know is, listen, it's all the same story over and over again. The oppression, the deficiencies in education, the economics, they're the same. Look at someone like Armstrong and feel inspired. Look at someone like Armstrong and feel like you can do something. Look at someone like Armstrong and feel like you are somebody, regardless of how your country treats you. You are still somebody, and you still can contribute and feel good about yourself and make other people feel good. I think that's what hip hop should learn from Louis Armstrong.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carolyn Forster. Here's what happened in Carolyn Talks podcast. And thank you for joining us. So this is a question that I think everyone on the team can answer. So one of the things that we were talking about Louis Armstrong is that he created his own song. Like he as a musician, he's original. No one had the structure, the chords, progressions that he had. He's a pure savant, as you would say. And something I found really interesting with this film is, to me, it's kind of structured not linearly. So I wanted to ask you if the way he played music and the way he sang his songs actually inspired how you went about making this film and crafting the way the story was told, because to me, the story doesn't flow linearly. It kind of backtracks through time and through his story. So could you just talk about how you came up with the filming process and how it looks visually, and as well as how the stories are being told?
Well, Jason's super qualified to tackle that, but I will say that there's a lot to cover. There's a lot to cover. And if you told this story in a linear fashion, it would take 2 years. He achieved and accomplished so much, interacted with so many different musicians, traveled to so many different places. It would take a lifetime to tell the story. So we wanted to do something that gave you a real portrait of who the man was. And the man liked laxatives and he liked marijuana. You know, these kinds of things get you closer to, you know, he made collages for himself. You know, these kinds of things get you closer to understanding who the man was. But the rhythm and the editing and all the other stuff, I tip my hat to Mr. Jason Pollard, who can give you more information.
I mean, the actual structure was you know, planned out with the help of Sacha, Julie, and Justin, where, you know, at first we assembled Lewis's entire life, and then, you know, Sacha and Julie we all had a conversation, and we talked about, well, what would happen if we switched it up a little bit? What would happen if we started with different places, you know, start times in his life, and, as you say, go to different points in his life. So that kind of influenced the structure of the pods. And in terms of rhythmically, I mean, honestly, it was the rhythm of his voice and the rhythm and the way he told stories. You know, Lewis really has a distinct way of speaking and talking, and his storytelling ability is, you know, next to none. So, you know, in terms of just telling stories, just basically falling into the editorial rhythm of the way Lewis tells the story, the way he plays his music. So if we think, you know, if you think about Black and Blue, you know, slow song, but we kind of put in his voice and other voices speaking about him. Or if there's a faster song like the barbecue song, which I can't remember the full name right now. You know, again, you want to pick up the pace a little bit. So, you know, I would say it's really Lewis's voice. You know, Lewis's voice on the tapes, Lewis's voice in the archival footage, Lewis's playing that really dictated the flow, and then we kind of just went from pod to pod, just hit different, what we thought were important parts and important sections of his life. As Sacha said, I mean, there's a lot left on the cutting room floor. If we try to tell all of his life, it would be a 10-part series, an interesting one, but a very long one. So that's what influenced the style.
Mm-hmm. Hi, I'm Nancy Green with Film Critique. And I was really curious about how he kept track of his life. And he wanted to make sure that whatever was written about him or put down in history was from his perspective. So I wanted to know how you went about kind of putting those things together, other people's perceptions of him and experiences versus how much material you were going to use from his own writings.
I mean, pretty much we organized it by sections of his life. I mean, Lewis, we found the first half of his life, Lewis told the most times, right? A number of times, Lewis would tell the story, the origin story, from New Orleans to about the mid-40s, mid-50s, right? He said that a number of different times. So that was kind of easy to put in. And then Amilca Palmer, who was our archival producer, said, you know, she found another archive with a whole bunch of his contemporaries talking about him. So as we dug into those, they were able to expound on different parts of Lewis's life. So Danny Baker was able to, because he was from New Orleans like Lewis, was really able to give more depth into the segregation that, you know, a person like Lewis would feel in the early 1900s, right? Or what a musician like Lewis would feel coming back to New Orleans, which we discussed, and other musicians who played with Lewis at that time, and so on and so forth, right? Other musicians spoke to different parts of Lewis's life based on their experiences with him, right? Whether they were touring, whether they were fans, you know. And that's all, you know, basically what we were trying to do was to just give as much depth as Lewis would give in his personal recordings, right? We also wanted to have other people kind of fill in the blanks about the different experiences that Lewis, you know, faced and went through, you know, throughout his life, to give us another perspective on that. And, you know, it was just whoever was the stronger voice on a particular topic made it into the cut.
And I also think, Jason, that the decision Sacha stuck by this all the way is not to have any talking head academics, not to have anyone who really wasn't with Louis on the ground, experiencing what he was experiencing, with the exception of Ricky Riccardi, who is the scholar, and it really qualified to speak about Louis. And then Wynton Marsalis, who's the president of the foundation, but also from New Orleans. And we feel very qualified to speak about Louis's playing and his talent. So other than that, we really wanted to make sure the film was coming from the heart of each person. So all of those oral histories are musicians talking about playing with Louis, being on the road with Louis, performing with Louis, what a hard worker he was, how he ran them ragged, the tough things they had to face on the road. So I think that these additions and the decision to stay away from the academics and to stay inside of Louis's life makes it extremely authentic and powerful.
It was about striking a balance. I mean, he was very vigilant when it came to his press. I mean, I don't know how many people were collecting press clippings back in the 30s, you know, and putting books together. I think he's pretty early on that. So he was fascinated with how he was covered, because I'm sure there weren't many Black people who were getting that kind of coverage anyway. And when you read some of the coverage, it's like straight up rape, people calling him a monkey, like just crazy stuff that you just wouldn't believe. So I'm sure things like that fueled his desire to want to have some kind of control or say so in the way that his story was being told. And I'm assuming that he knew that one day things would get better. And so, like a really industrious squirrel, he gathered all of his materials in a way that, you know, I tell people that I really believe that he is the co-director of this film, because with all the materials that he left behind and all the people who spoke about him, I mean, you couldn't get better access to better materials to tell a better story.
Abercrombie, the coalition. The documentary opens up with what I say carries a lot of weight in regards to him not going out there and protesting in the way that others want him to protest. My question is, one of the biggest, for me, I always felt was the biggest protest song was Black and Blue, and of course, Go Down Moses. Do you feel, or was it ever touched upon during a research, that he released those songs as a form of saying, this is me protesting? Or was this something this was always inside of him, that he was just waiting for the opportunity to get out?
I don't think he ever woke up saying, I'm going to be a civil rights leader or an activist. I think he woke up saying, I'm an artist, and this is how I'm going to express myself, and this is my art. And my art happens to reflect me being Black. And my art reflecting me being Black by default reflects others who look like me. So I think that he had a sense that, you know, yeah, this song is going to say something to people and hopefully people are paying attention. But I don't know if we have the information where he woke up one day and say, yeah, I'm going to do this because I want to change the world. I personally think with Armstrong, it starts with his own desire to express himself. That's why he made collages for himself. That's why he took time to write fans letters. You know, the process of being creative was important to his survival, I think. That's what kept him going.
There's a great line in the film toward the end in that Ossie Davis archive, which I think for all of us, when we first saw that, when our archivist uncovered it, I think it was that aha moment of this is the thesis of the movie. It's kind of unbelievable. But he refers to, you know, Louis keeping his manhood in his horn. And I just thought that's a very poetic way of describing what Sacha just said, where, you know, he was not outwardly an activist. He was not outwardly someone who was going on the front lines. In fact, he says at one point in the movie that he was always afraid that if he did march, he could get hit in the chops and it could end his career. But where he was able to express himself was through his instrument. And you know, to Sacha and Jason's credit, to start the movie with that particular rendition of Black and Blue, which was from, if I'm not mistaken, it's a BBC archive, but Julie, you might remember where it was recorded. I don't know if it was in London or somewhere else.
I want to say it was Germany, but I'm not sure.
It's just so in your face. I mean, literally in your face. The horn is in your face. His mouth is in your face. The way that they filmed that really just captures that, I think, that sentiment of where he kept his manhood and where he kept his feelings and how he was able to put them out there. Like Sacha said, in a way where to some listening to it, it's entertaining and it's a great song. And then to others, they're hearing exactly the message behind those lyrics and the message behind those notes that he's playing and the way that he's playing it and the emotion behind that.
Hi, I'm Jonita Davis for Detour XP and the Black Cape. I want to go back to the editing and kind of piggyback off of Nancy's question. I know when you get these big research projects and you find all this great stuff, all these great stories, and you talked about all these stories you found. I think Julie said something about everybody had their own stories about him. Some stuff had to be cut, or a lot of stuff had to be cut, probably in your case. But I want to know if there's anything from each of you that you had to cut away that really kind of you had to debate on, or was there anything you had to really discuss very hard, or any kind of favorite stories of yours personally for each of you that had to go on the cutting room floor?
Armstrong was an ambassador, the jazz ambassador, right? He went around the world making people smile with his music. And there were times when he might have inadvertently been a pawn of the United States in terms of what the agenda might have been on behalf of the United States. And that in and of itself is a very complex network of ideas and facts that you can't touch on lightly. I mean, there's probably a whole film in it.
Mm-hmm.
So that would have been something that would have been great, but we don't have the space. I mean, there are people, some critics who have said, how dare you all try to fit in what you fit in the amount of time you had. Like, he's Armstrong, he deserves 8 episodes. And the answer is sure. So, just like you do with chitlins, you work with what you got to make something good. And so I think based on the amount of time we had, we tried to be as effective as possible to help people understand who the man was. But, there are things, there's always a hidden hand. And as we know from the film, he was very patriotic and was proud to be an American. But I think later in life, when he figured certain things out, he felt duped in many ways. And that's a lot to unpack. And we certainly didn't have the time to do that.
And I think when we started the film, we approached it in terms of themes, almost like if you could picture a word cloud, like what are the most important themes? And the larger ones were racism, patriotism, music, obviously, and then there were smaller themes. And so I think we felt like we had accomplished what we wanted as long as we got the bigger themes in. And there were many other directions we could have gone in, but we stayed kind of true to the message of the film, which is these sides of Lewis that we found the most fascinating, the least talked about, the least well known, and a lot of music that was not well known, particularly the early music. So by laying out, it was a very interesting first conversation, just laying out these themes and writing them down and looking at them was a really good guide for us in the end.
No, I was going to say 2 parts that I missed. I mean, Sacha alluded to it, is Lewis's visit to the Congo during the time of Patrice Lumumba's assassination, which is a fascinating story. He's really in the heart of that during the Congo Revolution. So it's always, as Sacha said it as well, it was a very tricky story to tell. And I don't think we had enough time to tell it, but if you have some time, definitely research his role in the Congo during that time.
Where he was sent by the State Department to play there.
Right, as an ambassador, which then fits into his eventual protest about the treatment of the students in Little Rock. So a very interesting section. And then the second section is, I just forgot it, I literally just had it in my head, I just forgot it. So I'll just say Lewis in the Congo.
And I was just going to add that we've all worked on music projects before or projects about notable individuals, and there's a tendency for people to want to say, oh, it's the definitive version of this person's life, right? It's the definitive film about this person. And I think this is a person and a story that defies being called definitive in any regard. It's so expansive. We could have made probably 4 or 5 different versions of this movie, and hopefully others will. I think this is a film that at its best, celebrates all the themes that Sacha really was able to zero in on, and perhaps parts of his life that aren't as well known. And then hopefully down the road, others could tell, additional stories about him, because it's so worthy to be able to do a deep dive on so many different aspects of him.
Jason, was your thought, they say I look like God?
They Say I Look Like God's another one. Yeah, Lewis does a beautiful rendition of that song in a play that was written that only was performed once. We try to look for, some tapes from that play, but it's a gorgeous song, and it goes back to what somebody else had said, where it's not a protest song specifically, right? But you can take it as such, right? When Louis Armstrong saying, they say I look like God, but it's a powerful statement that one can take in a number of different ways.
And one of the pieces to that story is that when they first wrote the song, they expected him to sing it as if it were a typical, more upbeat, conventional Louis Armstrong song. And when he sat down and started to record it, they were really surprised that was the direction he took with that song, is to make it very heartfelt and soulful and not a upbeat throwaway song. So there's these moments in Lewis's life where he really gets very thoughtful, and he really gets into what life means and who he is in the world. And that was one of them that we ended up having to take out.
Thank you very much. All of that is very interesting. And thank you, Jason, for the homework. I'm going to look forward to it.
Ray Cornelius here with Upfront Inside Atlanta's entertainment industry. And like Janine, I also worked on the inaugural Jazz Music Awards that took place here in Atlanta over the weekend. My question is for the filmmakers. How did this story or this project challenge you? I think, and I'm assuming as a filmmaker, that each time you take on a project, there are certain things that you encounter, certain things that you expect, some things that you don't expect. So what did you not expect, or how did this really challenge you as a storyteller with this story, with this figure, with Mr. Armstrong?
Well, for me, the only challenge was my early perception of who he was. I mean, I have a journalism background, and for me, some of the best stories I ever wrote were about people I knew very little about or weren't very interested in. I remember writing a story about Bone Thugs-n-Harmony before I did one of the first major stories on Bone Thugs-n-Harmony, and I knew nothing about Cleveland or anything about them, and I was somewhat disinterested. But when I got with them and spent time with them, I learned a lot, and I felt I wrote one of my better pieces. But for me, I look at this as journalism. So with journalism, there's always a curve. There's always things that get thrown at you that you just have to adjust, and it's a part of the process. I mean, it's a little different in that you're dealing with archival, you're dealing with someone who's no longer here. So a lot of the pieces are already there. So there's not like someone who's refusing an interview or being difficult or, causing challenges. So outside of the surprises of learning about who he was and my own sort of disability in thinking that he was one way and learning that he was completely different.
I think, this is something to what Justin had mentioned. I think another challenge editorially was, I remember Justin asking me, well, is there a main interview, a master interview of Lewis telling his whole life from beginning to end? And there never really was, and that's usually when you put these pieces together about music artists, you really like that one main interview to kind of work off of, right? Because at the end of the person's life, they go through the whole life and they say the highlights, and that kind of leads you into different sections. And Lewis wasn't that way. Like I said, he pretty much covered the first half of his life pretty well in a number of different times. But after his popularity grew, I think he became a little bit more insular. And that's where we had to go to the thousands and thousands of personal recordings. So that was tough, trying to go through all that footage and figure out, okay, these are the pieces that we want. These are the themes that we want to highlight. These are the emotions we want to highlight. These are the places we want to go. And it was very difficult to go through all that stuff and pull out the jewels. So, not only did we go through the recordings, but we went through the writings as well. And that's where Nas comes in, with reading the writings, because actually in his writings, it felt a little bit more clearer where he wanted, what he felt about certain aspects of his journey. So, that was super challenging. The thing I discovered is that, as we've been saying throughout, is that everybody protests in a different way. When I first started, putting stuff together, I think I asked my dad, was Louis Armstrong kind of a person who would just protest in the background and would kind of just, he put one face out to the people, then do his thing, kind of in the background. And that wasn't him. That wasn't him. He had his own particular way of protesting injustice that was, really particular and special to Louis. And the challenge was bringing that out, whether it be through song, whether it be through recordings, whether it be through writings, whether it be through collage. That was really the challenge of bringing that out, of who this guy was and how he, fought for justice and equality.
And I would just say the sheer volume of the archive available to us was what made this logistically incredibly challenging. And it's not like the archive was just sitting ready to be edited. It wasn't like it was all transferred and digitized and restored. There was the archive that the foundation had, which was most of his audio recordings. A lot of it was what we use, like Jason was saying, as his sort of hero interviews, and the scrapbooks and the letters and the photography. Some of it was just in shoeboxes, and the audio for the most part was on reel-to-reel tape. So it took almost 2 years just to digitize, restore, and then transcribe all of that audio, just to be able to start even listening to it, just to get a sense of what was there. Outside of Ricky Riccardi, the archivist from the foundation, no human being alive had listened to all of what was on those tapes prior to Jason and Julie and Sacha and the team. And then the other piece of it is all the other archive that's just out there in the world. He was the most famous person in the world, literally, for a good chunk of his life. Certainly one of the most photographed, one of the most recorded. Everywhere he went, there was newsreel footage. There were these interviews that Jason was talking about. Some of it was on film, some of it was audio. And because there hadn't been, as I was saying before, the definitive Louis Armstrong film, none of that archive had been accessed. So even just finding out where it is, there's a great story that Julie and the archival team was really on the front end of, but we early on found out that at Rutgers, which has a pretty remarkable jazz archive, which they're kind of known for their jazz archive, there were these just film canisters, literally film cans labeled Louis Armstrong, 1969, Louis Armstrong, 1970, 16 millimeter cans. But because it was the middle of COVID and the school was closed, it was like a Herculean effort just to get someone to go there, permission to get back on campus, and then just photograph the film cans just so we could see them and see, oh my God, there's something there, but we don't even know what's on there. And then it took so many more months just to extract them from the archive, bring them to a place in New York where they could actually be fully digitized and then eventually restored. And we found some unbelievable, never before seen footage, through that. And that same story kind of happened with an archive in London, an archive at Yale. There's an incredible jazz archive. So all that material was coming in literally over about a 2-3 year period as the team was starting to cut the movie. And that archive, as Jason was just describing, really informed how we could tell the story. Even once we sort of gravitated toward the themes, what archive could then reinforce that. I've done a lot of archival docs before. I know this team has too. I've never worked on a film with this many assets before. I don't think anybody has, frankly, just in terms of like how many individual pieces of bespoke archive went into each frame of this movie.
And the thing about the film we found at Rutgers is it was decaying. And when film starts to decay, it's an irreversible process. It's just going to go. And so when we were trying to get the film so we could transfer it, we found out that it was decaying. And if we hadn't, gone in there and transferred the film, it would have been lost. And there were some beautiful, interesting stuff on that film.
Thank you, guys.
Hey, it's Rhonda. I want to talk about the impact of the women in his life and what kind of insight you guys think that, his two wives in particular brought to this doc.
Well, his wives made him man up. If it wasn't for his wife telling him, I'm not going to go, my man can't be second fiddle, you got to be number one. He was too afraid to go against his mentor, and she was the inspiration, and he credits her. He's listening to women, crediting women, and benefiting from women. So I think he was a very progressive gentleman for his time. Even for now, I think he's a progressive kind of fellow.
Okay. Lucille is his last wife is such a huge presence. And for me, she provided a lot of context. Did you find that as well?
Definitely. I mean, it's, as Sacha said, there's two, he was married 4 times, but there are 2 pillars in his life. It's Lil Hardin at the beginning. So as Sacha said, Lil really pushes Lewis's career, right? Makes him, in a way, not even in a way, she does make him from a sideman, because without Lil Hardin, Lewis might still be a sideman playing second fiddle to Joe Oliver, right? She's the one who pushes him. She's the one who says, I can't be with a second fiddle. She's the one who, promotes him. We don't have the story in the film, but she's the one who promotes him as the world's greatest trumpet player, right? She really sees the genius inside of him and forces him to take center stage. And then, as you said, it was his last wife, she, grounds him, right? So we have that great story where they talk about, he was living out of a suitcase, going from hotel to hotel in a small apartment, but she buys the house and she grounds him in place, and she gives him the sense of home, right? And she's able to, as he's getting older and older, as our significant others do, she's the one who takes care of him, right, at the end, right? She's the one who's basically his caretaker and making sure everything is good and everything is in process and everything is in order. But again, she provides that a home for him and a home base and a place to go to, right? So, Lucille and Lil are just these 2 very strong women who were super influential and actually knew each other, right? Lucille and Lil knew each other and had a relationship, So the 2, the ex-wife and the wife both knew each other and realized how important they were to this man's life. So they were super important, and Lucille, and Lucille has a great line. She has one of my favorite lines in the film, where she says, "A prophet has no honor," right? Where she talks about what Lewis's actual involvement was in the civil rights movement. She's the one who gives us that initial insight into what he said, and the hurt and the pain that he felt, that he only really expressed to her and a few close friends. So again, she's that confident as well, that he can rely upon. So yeah, very, very huge instrumental roles in his life.
Julie, Justin, Jason, and Sacha, thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful work about this iconic man. On behalf of the world's largest group of African-American TV critics and film critics, we thank you for watching this episode of AAFCA Roundtables. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.